So I've talked about kinetic weapons before, and a lot of people are really confused by them, and I can see why. It seems to them like regression. If we have weapons that can explode, that can use some form of tandem charge to penetrate, that deserve to be more technologically advanced, coming from advanced tanks, from advanced missile launching tubes. I did a virtual conference a while ago on the future of kinetic weaponry considering its recent resurgence. And a woman who was attending asked a question. And as I was talking about the kinetic warhead that was used on a particular tank shell, the woman asked me, well, she didn't ask me, she assumed. She said, so basically, it's a really hard arrow. Instantly, the chat at the bottom of the screen was basically filled with snide remarks, the laughing emoji, and the question this woman had asked, or the comment she'd just made, wasn't actually wrong. I'd made it clear in the talk, as I will be here, that yes, kinetic rounds are just a development of the basic arrow. It's the launch of something which uses kinetic power to penetrate and do damage, but that doesn't mean that it's regression from the more, perhaps, advanced explosive tank shells, explosive missiles. Obviously, this technology is far more advanced than the arrow, but the principle is inherently the same. The woman was right. People have a preconception about kinetic warheads that simplicity makes them less useful, regressive. I would argue the opposite. The functionality and simplicity is precisely what makes them useful. And so we'll go over it today, because I think that's a rather good thing to do. A kinetic warhead, for those of you who don't know, is a warhead found on a munition. That could be a missile, a shell, the rods of God, and it uses kinetic energy to destroy a target. So while it may get launched using explosive, once it is launched, it's simply an advanced chunk of material. It goes really fast, penetrates a target, and destroys it in the process. And again, this beautiful simplicity is a benefit, not least for functionality, but because I, somebody who knows very little about physics, can actually understand it. So in short, what a kinetic warhead does for a munition is it gives it more penetrative power. To say it simply, it's a large, specialized, more electronically advanced bullet, or an arrow, or a spear. It uses the basic human principle that we've used for hunting, for warfare, since the inception of both. It uses a hard, sharp object traveling at a certain speed, whether that be the glide of a spear, the swing of a sword, the travel of a kinetic warhead. It's a sharp, hard object that does damage because it travels at speed, and whatever it hits, it destroys. And there are some odd kinetic munitions that have been developed recently which don't follow this traditional path, but I'll talk about that as well. First off, we have developed a kinetic warhead. For what reason? Why don't we have these explosive warheads anymore? Or why have we even gone back? Why have we seemingly regressed? Kinetic warheads aren't this pure innovation. They're not classical evolution of an explosive warhead, are they? They are the answer, however, to better defensive systems in recent years. So if we look specifically at tank shells, for a long time, having a heat warhead, heat is a high explosive anti-tank warhead, that was enough. You look at videos in the early 90s of munitions test, and it's just development of a heat warhead. You see really large explosions here. These explosions use directed fragments towards a tank to penetrate it from there, utilizing the power created from the explosion. Yet, as the mid-90s came around, armor systems around the world, including the enemies, were getting better. Active armor, for those of you who don't know, is where armor on tanks, when struck, explodes outwards, and it pushes the munition that's coming towards it away. And this reduces its effect hugely, of course. And so what we see is the introduction of reactive armor, the introduction of composite armor, which is known as cobham armor, developed by the British in the 50s and 60s, which made everything far more tough to penetrate anyway. And what we also see is that there has, in recent years, far more recently, there's been the implementation of HKAPS, hard kill active protection systems, If you play Call of Duty, you may see this as akin to a trophy system. The idea is that you launch something to divert the path of a certain munition coming in. You launch something to preemptively basically get it to explode. Prematurely detonate is probably the best way to put it. And even for stuff that has inert warheads or unarmed warheads, until it reaches a certain proximity, you see brimstone variants doing this, where until they get close enough to the target, if you shoot them down, they're not going to explode, they'll just drop. But at this sort of range, where they're really close enough to be hit by the HK APS, or reactive armor, or react with reactive armor, they are armed, whatever missile it is, because it's a short range. So how do we combat this? There are a few things that have been developed. The first was the top attack missile, designed to strike tanks from the top, where they are, of course, least protected. Second, the tandem warhead, which uses an initial charge to blow a big hole, and then a harder composite armor is penetrated by the actual warhead. So it uses an initial charge, and then the second warhead, as it were, blows past this. And this first warhead of the tandem warhead, it can disable active armor systems before the real munition hits. So that's pretty important. So we see three things here: top attack missile, tandem warhead, and of course what we're talking about today, the kinetic warhead. And so it's the answer to active hard kill systems, it's the answer to reactive armor, it's the answer to composite armor, it's the answer to better protection of specifically tanks. So within tanks, this kinetic warhead is known as a KEP, it's a shell. It's a kinetic energy penetrator, which is utilized in its subsection, which is a high velocity armor piercing warhead, which is HVAP for short. In any case, what it does is it uses a long flechette-like thing, which is of course very heavy, launched from a tank shell, and without high explosive or proximity detonation mechanisms, just penetration, the KEP uses a simple equation to actually hit its target and destroy it. And that's not necessarily anything that relies upon proximity, that relies upon the explosive itself. It uses a few things, which are simple laws of physics: high mass, high speed, and for lack of a better word, because I don't know too much physics, pointiness. High mass is incorporated on most of these munitions because basically you need more penetrative power. The KEP takes it even further than most warheads. So a lot of warheads do have high mass because you need something which is going to apply the same weight. But these sort of warheads need to be really heavy, and you can make them really heavy because there is more space. You can make them denser. So rather than just using the regular tungsten carbide, which is sort of the benchmark for most warheads, they use something called depleted uranium, which is way harder, really, really hard. I don't know how much they're allowed to use it anymore, but nonetheless, they did develop it. For high speed, so that's for mass. For high speed, we see within the shell itself the absence of detonation mechanisms, of excessive electronics, of more than basic guidance systems. So one can pack way more explosive into the shell before launch. And what that means is that the kinetic projectile goes way faster. In regard to the pointiness, which will also make it go faster because it will be more aerodynamic, we see them literally just make it pointy. That's pretty intuitive. But that makes it more penetrative, to the point that a lot of these warheads, a lot of British KEPs, they can penetrate reactive armor before it can even explode, and then go on to break through the composite armor. Now, there is another misconception that I would perhaps avoid, and that misconception is that basically kinetic warheads wouldn't do too much damage, that it would just create the equivalent of a cartoon-sized hole, sort of a black hole that you would see in Looney Tunes, that sort of thing, and it wouldn't harm anything or any people inside. But what happens is once the munition has penetrated, it does something called spalling. And what that is it's turning of this kinetic warhead into a load of rather fine chunks. Small sand-like particles. It turns into really fast metal pebbles and sand, and it wrecks anything that may be inside the tank. And that has huge advantage, because it's not merely set fragmentation. It's often smaller particles and larger particles, which can do a lot more damage. It's variance that does the right thing. And it depends upon the actual composite armor how much it will, I guess, decrease in size or not decrease in size. But nonetheless, it will be most efficient for whatever it's hitting. These munitions don't necessarily sacrifice functionality. Unlike the HESH warhead, they do rely on penetration. There are positives, negatives, but in general, the only real issue with them is that they don't necessarily have such active control systems, and they rely on penetration, as a lot of warheads do. They can't just fracture from the inside as the HESH does. So kinetic warheads, in this conventional sense, they've been used a lot in recent years, and they're very effective against vehicles. They've proven that. One of my favorite missiles, Starstreak, uses triple kinetic dart system to do exactly the same thing. It's an anti-air missile, and the concept isn't just limited to what we might consider traditional guns. It's applied far more broadly now. So in the same manner that small arms might be firing bullets, it works really well on missiles as well, because the power that missiles pack, because of the velocity they can get up to, is huge. And of course, unlike bullets, they actually have guidance, so it's really ideal. Now, for the more unusual, there are more controversial systems. If we talk about the more traditional systems, you see KEP warheads on tank shells. You see Starstreak using kinetic darts. You see Meteor utilizing, sure, explosive systems, but also kinetic power in order to strike its target and basically have dual function. In recent years, I thought this was worth talking about. There's a far more controversial system, which has been utilized by the US for assassinations. This kinetic warhead utilizes a splay mechanism. So, in a conventional kinetic warhead, you just have this thing which hits like an arrow, and then spools on the inside. But this is different to a conventional kinetic warhead. Instead of going for maximum penetrative power before breaking apart inside, splay warheads effectively deploy things. They're proving to be quite potent, for better or worse. They are sometimes known as ninja warheads. They've been implemented in the Hellfire R9X so far. They're called the ninja warhead because they make very little noise, because they are kinetic, they don't explode. They make very little noise in the terminal phase because, of course, they don't have explosives. And instead they deploy a fan-like blade system. These blades, I believe the R9X has 6 blades in total, as the missile is traveling, begin to rotate quickly, which it doesn't take a genius to figure out that makes a bit of a blender system. In any case, it makes near no noise from deployment because it's launched from a Reaper drone, and so launch also makes very little noise because it's at such a high altitude, it's at such high distance. The drones tend to fly high. All in all, it doesn't make that much noise during launch, it doesn't make noise during deployment, and it makes far less noise than any other missile that could strike during actual terminal phase hit. So as the blades spin, it makes this blender-like effect, which, as I've said, makes it incredibly precise. That being that the person assassinated doesn't really stand a chance. There's no warning, no chance of survival at all, really, because it is such a precise munition. While this sort of munition won't penetrate tanks, it will penetrate concrete, glass, thinner metal, because it is still packing a punch. It's going fast, it's heavy. So while it can't really be used tactically on the battlefield, it has huge strategic advantage in the neutralization of key enemies. It's been praised a lot in the US because its non-explosive nature leaves behind key visual and DNA evidence in order to confirm a successful strike. It's also been praised, and I'd probably agree with this, for being so precise. So I think the saying is that one can be striking the passenger of a moving car and the driver would be entirely unharmed. In any case, it does appear that in the success of this program, governments may be adopting it. The USA is certainly trying to make it more precise. They're adding more programs and making it smaller. So it might not necessarily be a great picture, but nonetheless, it does minimize collateral damage, unnecessary deaths in a strategic attack, and that's a good thing. So they're actually being utilized, even if for more unconventional purposes, for good, for more strategic use rather than tactical use. In any case, more than these two types of munition, kinetic warheads are used a lot for defense systems, as opposed to just attack systems. So they're used for stopping ballistic missile threats, the destruction of other missile systems against satellites, because within the arena of space, they are far more predictable and far more effective than higher explosive munitions because they are more predictable and it's ample. It's enough, and the, I guess, lighter weight nature of them means that they're easier to launch to get up into space. Additionally, I'm not sure many of you have seen the video of the incredible BAE systems using a railgun to fire a kinetic projectile. For those of you who don't know, railgun is a linear motor device that basically it pulls along a munition really, really quick through a barrel to propel it out the end using electromagnetic attraction. So the munition has to at least be surrounded by something that is ferromagnetic. And a coil gun does much the same thing, except it uses an electromagnetic coil, just a really strong solenoid. And then a mass driver does the same thing in space. So if we're to say that, let's say, railguns, despite the fact they're inefficient at the moment, and you can't even implement them on ships, if they are to be the future, and it appears there's extensive testing that's going into that, then perhaps in the future, these sort of kinetic warheads are going to be more important. And that will be a huge step up in the world. That will be incredibly impactful, particularly because these things can travel at insane speeds nowadays. And it doesn't even necessarily rely on missile systems, on precise guidance systems, because you can just launch these things with such power from railguns, from coil guns, from mass launchers, that their guidance systems in the end only have to be in the terminal phase effectively. They can be launched in such a powerful manner that they don't require constant propulsion. So that's yet to be seen. I'm not going to talk about the rods of God today. I won't. The basic overview is that large spear-like things the size of a street lamp, they could basically be launched from space and through gravity upon re-entry could get above Mach 10, and that would create something worse than a nuclear strike. Yet officially they're not in use by any nation, so I'm not going to be talking about them today. Are kinetic warheads the future? For strategic personnel attacks, apparently so. For other platforms, it appears they're increasing, becoming more commonplace, and if we're to believe that these advanced propulsion systems, initial propulsion systems which don't require mid-stage propulsion, are the future and becoming more commonplace, then it only makes sense that with increasing hypersonic capability, kinetic warheads will increase in commonness. We may see further introduction of them. They're faster, they're better for transport, they're often more accurate, cheaper, and that is really the only disadvantage, that they have to be more accurate because they don't have that explosive power. They're already really important, and it appears that they are becoming even more so. So I really would recommend you actually give them a look. They're incredibly important munitions, and they're going to be something which I believe, in speculation, we're going to be seeing more of in at least the next 10 years, particularly as guidance systems become more precise and as propulsion systems can be activated in the initial stage rather than the mid-phase stage. So we'll see. Hopefully that wasn't too much of a bore.